Good afternoon. Continue on with Robert Breaker's issue of slavery. He's all hyped up about the whites. Only white people. Look, we know history of slavery. And why the Bible didn't forbid it because it was common usage. And we know everybody was enslaved. People, you can be enslaved. Patrick of St. Patrick of Ireland, he was enslaved by some pirates from Scotland one time, and he escaped. Now, the issue with Robert's going to try to defend slavery in the Confederacy. That was particularly aimed at one race. And Robert's already changing the word servant or servants to slaves. He's already changing the King James Bible. It doesn't say slaves. It says servant or servants. And that was Canaan, not Ham. I told you people years ago, this guy with his interracial thing, he was a racist. Now he's coming out and showing it. Now he's coming out. That's why he wouldn't pull it down. Let's go back here.
One of the sons of Noah is going to be a slave. So I'll have to put her back on screen sharing.
It doesn't say slave, it says servant. He's changing King James Bible.
Here if I can. And
that wasn't one of the sons of Noah. That was the grandson. It's Canaan, not Ham.
Share. All right. So Genesis chapter 9 and verse 25. And said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brother. And he said, blessed be...
That wasn't the son. That's the grandson.
The Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem.
What happened to Canaan? Canaan was wiped out. It was the Canaanites.
And Canaan shall be his servant. So Canaan was the son of Ham. And God said they're going to be servants or slaves.
Yeah, grandson. I mean, that was the grandson of Noah, not their son.
And in the future they were, and we'll get to that later a little bit about that. But the next time we see servant or slave, because that's
servant or slave, it doesn't say slave. He's changing King James Bible on you.
What a servant is, he's a slave, is in Genesis chapter 12. And in Genesis 12, verse 16, guess who had slaves? Guess who had servants? Abraham. Genesis 12:16, and he entreated Abraham well for his sake, and he had sheep and oxen and he asses and men servants and maid servants and she asses and camels. Now here's something that I thought was interesting in verse 14 of chapter 14, Genesis 14:14. Look at this. Genesis 14:14, and when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants. Those would have been slaves. Was Abraham?
It says servants. It doesn't say slaves. It says servants.
I'm a slave owner. Yeah. And
it doesn't say slaves. King James Bible only.
He is trained.
He's using the Hebrew and Greek. I don't know what the Hebrew is on this. He used the doulos in the Hebrew, Greek. I don't know what the Hebrew might have actual word for servants.
Servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them into Dan. So these were slaves that were literally born to his servants, and Abraham kept them.
Servants, not slaves.
Now you can do what you want with that.
Yeah, that's Robert Breaker's modus operandi. You can do what you want with it. He always puts something out, and then he says you can do what you want with it. Yeah.
Okay, a lot of people will say, well, then I hate the Jews now. Okay, help yourself. But the first man who was a Jew, Abraham, he was a slave owner. How come they never talk about it?
Didn't say slave owner. King James Bible only people? Does it say slave owner there? I see servant. Why is he reading slave when it says servant?
Why is it that today...
Then I'm going to get all Robert Breaker people. You're picking on Robert Breaker. You're just jealous of Robert Breaker. You're jealous of his ministry. He's racist. He claims to be King James Bible only, and now he's reading from the Hebrew, not even from the Greek. He's saying that word doesn't mean servant. It means slave. Because he says the meaning is the same. Not in English it isn't. You have to look at the word servant and servant. And he says they came indentured servitude began in America. The blacks were not brought over here, but as indentured servants. They were brought over here as slaves.
They always talk about white man owned slave, white man's
evil. What's he bring that up for? What the heck is he bring up the issue of white men? Only racists is worried about the issue of white men and black men and Indian men. Okay.
People, white men had slaves.
See? This is the point, people. This guy is so thin-skinned, and you just like Buckman, you pull it back, you're gonna find a racist.
That we're gonna learn that there's been a lot more people that own slaves than just the white man.
Yeah, so what? When the whites held slave on the Confederacy, and the Confederacy made the shift on the John Calhoun, they looked at slavery as a positive good to the black. The original issue was they saw slavery as an evil that eventually would be removed. That's why the word slavery wasn't put in the Constitution. But then they began seeing it as a positive good and justified slavery owning a particular race, the blacks, and they put that in their Confederate Constitution, the Negro, to be enslaved.
But today, a lot of people try to demonize white people and say, white people own slaves, white people own slaves. Let's
look at this guy.
Look at the history of slavery. Let's look at
No, I'm looking forward to looking at the history of slavery from Robert Breaker's perspective. This thin-skinned Nickelodeon.
All right, let's look at the entire thing. Go ahead, George. You want to say something?
Oh, no.
Yeah, you can't get any words. Robert Breaker's on. He thinks he knows everything. He does all the talking.
I'm saying you're absolutely correct. The white people, they did own slaves. No, I'm just jumping in there.
Okay.
But where I wanted to go back was...
Slavery was never a racial issue until the Confederacy. It was understood people owned slaves. It became a racial issue under the Confederacy because they justified their slavery looking at the blacks as being inferior and using that nonsense to curse their hand.
And Philemon talks about slavery too. I mean, the whole book about Philemon speaks about slavery. But what Paul's message, or what Paul's speaking about in Philemon, it's the slavery from back then is not really the same thing as what's going on today or what went on in the early 14th, 15th, 16th century.
It wasn't racial.
He was calling on, who was it, Esmus? But it was more of like, it was like an economic agreement, the slavery was back then. I mean, it was just something totally different. Different
okay, that's the New Testament. We'll get to the New Testament here in a minute. I've just got one more passage here in the Old Testament to finish it up. And like you said, there is a difference between slavery for life and slavery for a certain time. And as you said it correctly, it was an economic thing. And that's what's called the difference between indentured servitude and a slavery, which is a servant or slave for life. And this is actually found in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy chapter 15. And it explains to us, and in America, we're going to study here in a little bit about the history of slavery in America. It's the same thing. It started with indentured servitude, and then it turned.
The blacks were not brought over here as indentured servants. They were brought over here as slaves.
Turned to owning a slave for life. But those were two separate things. So Deuteronomy chapter 15.
Yeah, white settlers coming over here as indentured servants. But not blacks. Blacks were taken as slaves. They were indentured servants.
15 verse 12. Can you still see it here on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So Deuteronomy 15:12, and if thy brother, an Hebrew man or an Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let them go free from thee. So here's a Jew owning another Jew as a servant or a slave. It's not about the color of their skin. It was
then it wasn't about the color of skin. But he's going to try to defend the Confederacy. He has a whole article on that, people, defending the Confederacy on the idea of slavery. And the Confederacy did make race an issue.
This, like you said, an economic thing. And usually there was a contract. And in the Old Testament law, it was usually because a man owed a debt to another man that he couldn't pay. So he became his slave until he paid off the debt. And the Bible tells us that he had to work and he couldn't stay for more than 6 years. Well, 7 years. And he was let free in the 7th year. And I lost it. Where was I? Yeah, in verse 13. And when thou sendest him out from thee, he shall go from thee. Thou shalt not let him go away empty. Thou shalt furnish him liberally out of thy flock and out of thy floor and out of thy winepress and and of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give them. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Therefore I command thee this thing to this day. Remember, the Jews were once slaves to the Egyptians. The Egyptians being, black people, and the Jews were slaves to them. That's interesting.
Yeah, so what? Why is that interesting? Only to racists would that be interested. People.
But here's someone that willingly, of their own free will, wanted to be a slave. Look what it says starting in verse 16. And it shall be, if he say unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee in thine house, because he is well with thee, then thou shalt take an awl, and thrust it through his ear into the door, and he shall be thy servant forever. And also,
do you see the word slave anywhere, people? He's supposed to be King James only. Where do you see the word slave anywhere in that passage?
So unto thy maidservant thou shalt do likewise. And it shall not seem hard unto thee when thou sendest him away from thee, for he hath been worth a double hired servant to thee in serving thee 6 years. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thou doest. So there's a thing in the law where a person can serve a man as a slave for 7 years.
It doesn't say slave. It says manservant. Servant.
Years. And then he says,
Maidservant.
you're just such a good man, and I love you, and I just enjoy being here. I just want to serve you forever. And
yeah, as a servant.
In that time, the Bible says that they were to put a hole in his ear. And that's, I don't know if that where the ancient pirates got from, but, a lot of the pirates would wear an earring. But isn't that weird?
Pirates.
That someone would want to be a slave for life?
It didn't say slave, Robert. It says servant. Stop changing the King James Bible. Let's put this up. This is a guy who claims to be King James only, and he's changing the word servant to slave every time he sees it. And he's going to try to defend slavery. Let's stop with this up. Amen. Thank you.